with peanut butter on his chin and an expression of mild curiosity about why everyone seemed upset. First Sergeant looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 6 weeks ago, he had told me he'd never had a soldier he couldn't train or chapter. He was looking at Kevin walk back from being lost in an area you couldn't get lost in. And I watched the last piece of that belief flicker and die right there on his face. After the field exercise, things moved faster. First Sergeant pushed the chapter recommendation to the commander. The commander pushed it to legal. Legal pushed back and asked for more documentation. Because legal always asks for more documentation. Because the file has to be airtight before they'll process a performance separation, and Kevin's file was the strangest one anyone had seen. Perfect test scores, catastrophic practical performance, an ASVAB that didn't match the soldier, counseling statements that read like a hallucination of some sort, but there were witnesses and signatures on every one. The legal review added roughly 6 weeks to the timeline. Kevin was still mine. Kevin was still in the DFAC every morning at 500. Kevin was still saying, "Roger, Sergeant," and meaning it, and doing something else entirely. December. Kevin had been in my DFAC for 3 months. I had used most of the notebook. Maybe I had already moved on to the second one, I can't truly remember. The system was moving. Slowly. The notebooks helped me put a handle on this Kevin that continued to defy all logic or explanation. Oh shit, this is also about the time that Kevin did the thing with the thermometer. That's part 4. That's the one that broke First Sergeant. Soldiers went to the hospital, all because I made a singular oversight.
If you are in need of a kidney transplant, you should know about the National Kidney Registry. The NKR is your best option for a faster transplant, a longer-lasting transplant, and a better matched kidney. Through participating transplant centers across the United States, the National Kidney Registry maximizes your chances for a successful transplant. Patients who register with or transfer to an NKR member center have shorter wait times, with 70% of patients transplanted within 90 days of activation. The NKR offers state-of-the-art matching technology with the potential for a low eplet mismatch, which typically results in a longer-lasting transplant. The technology may also allow patients to safely reduce immunosuppressant dosages. If you don't have a donor willing to donate on your behalf, the NKR's microsite program helps you search for a donor with free tools like a personal website and coaching from donor search experts. For more information, visit kidneyregistry.com/YNKR.
This is the Tempur-Pedic Breeze mattress, and it's designed to help you feel cool. So no more sweating all night, no kicking off the covers or blasting the air conditioning, because only the Tempur-Pedic Breeze is made with our one-of-a-kind cooling technology that pulls heat away from your body, so the mattress feels up to 10 degrees cooler all night long.
If you're tired of sleeping hot, shop at Ashley today to experience the Tempur-Breeze collection for cooler, deeper sleep. Discover your perfect sleep at an Ashley near you.
Singular oversight. Kevin's DFAC secret. Part 4. December at the Bragg is not cold by any real standard, but it's cold enough that soldiers complain, which means they eat more. Which means the DFAC is busier, which means more food moving through the kitchen, which means more opportunities for Kevin. I've been managing Kevin for 3 months. Managing is a generous word. I had been containing Kevin. The chapter paperwork was with legal. First Sergeant Hensley was pushing it. The commander was on board. The system was moving at the speed the system moves, which is slowly. And Kevin was still in my DFAC every morning at 5 o'clock because the Army does not let you bench a soldier while the paperwork processes. Kevin was still working. Kevin was still mine. After the field exercise, I had put Kevin on what I privately called the minimum damage rotation. Serving line, dish pit, dry storage inventory. Tasks where the worst case scenario was a mess, not a casualty. I had pulled him off all cooking, all prep involving raw proteins, and anything that required operating equipment with a fuel source. The LT asked me if I was developing Kevin or just warehousing him. I said both, sir, simultaneously. and he looked at me like he wanted to argue but didn't have the ammunition. The thermometer thing happened on a Wednesday. I know it was a Wednesday because Wednesday was our chicken day. We served fried chicken for lunch on Wednesdays. It was the one meal that soldiers actually looked forward to, which meant it was the one meal I could not afford to have go wrong, which means you already know where this is going. Here's what happened. I need to explain the thermometer calibration process first because the details matter. Every DFAC has probe thermometers, dial type, with a metal stem you stick into the food to check the internal temperature. These thermometers drift over time. The readings get inaccurate, so you calibrate them. The standard method is the ice point method. You fill a container with ice water, submerge the probe, wait for the needle to stabilize, and it should read 32 degrees Fahrenheit. If it doesn't read 32, you use the calibration nut on the back of the dial to adjust it until it does. Simple procedure. We calibrate every thermometer at the start of every shift. It takes about 2 minutes per thermometer. I had been doing the calibration myself since the field exercise because I did not trust Kevin with anything that affected food safety readings. On this particular Wednesday, I was late to the DFAC. My car wouldn't start, a dead battery. I got there at 5:20 instead of 4:50, which meant the morning prep was already underway when I walked in. Shen was running things. Shen was reliable. I was not worried. What I didn't know was that Kevin had arrived at 4:45, 15 minutes before anyone else, which was unusual because Kevin was always exactly on time. Never early, never late. Kevin arrived early, saw that the thermometers had not been calibrated yet, and decided to do it himself. I want to pause here to say something. Kevin deciding to calibrate the thermometers on his own initiative was, in a vacuum, the correct thing to do. Thermometers needed to be calibrated. They had not been calibrated. Kevin knew the procedure. Kevin was, in his mind, being helpful. He was being proactive the same way he had been proactive with the chicken and the walk-in on his first day. Kevin's instinct to take initiative was not the problem. Kevin's execution of that initiative was the problem. Kevin's execution of everything was the problem. Kevin filled a container with ice water. Correct. Kevin waited for the needle to stabilize. Correct. The needle settled at 36 degrees. This meant the thermometer was reading 4 degrees high. The correct adjustment is to turn the calibration nut until the needle moves down to 32 degrees. Kevin turned the calibration nut the wrong direction. He moved the needle up to 40. Now the thermometer was reading 8 degrees higher than actual temperature. Kevin did this to 3 thermometers. All 3 were now off by 8 degrees in the same direction. Kevin put them back in the thermometer rack and went to start his serving line setup, satisfied that he had contributed. Shen did not catch this, because Shen had no reason to check the calibration. The thermometers were in the rack. They looked normal. The calibration log had not been filled out, which should have been a flag, but the morning was busy, and Shen was covering my duties and his own, and the log got missed. I got there at 5:20 and went straight into the office to handle the administration I'd missed. I did not check the thermometers. I assumed they'd been done because they were always done. That was my mistake. I own that. I should have verified. I did not verify because for 3 months I had been the one doing it. And the one morning I wasn't there, Kevin was. The chicken went into the fryers at 10:30. At 11:15, the cook on fryer duty pulled the first batch and temped it. The temperature read 165. He logged it. Correct procedure, except the actual temperature of that chicken was about 157. At 157, chicken is probably fine. Probably. The USDA says 165 for a reason, and that reason is that 165 kills salmonella instantly. Below that, you need to hold it at temperature for a longer time to achieve the same kill rate. At 157, you need to hold for about 30 seconds. If the chicken went straight from the fryer to the serving line to a tray to a soldier's mouth, it might not have had that hold time. Might. The second batch came out at 11:45. The fryer temperature had dropped slightly because of how much chicken was cycling through. Second batch temped at 161 on the bad thermometer. Actual temp? About 153. That is below the safety threshold by any standard. By 12:30, approximately 200 soldiers had eaten fried chicken for lunch. By 1800, 6 p.m., 14 of them were in the aid station with symptoms consistent with foodborne illness. Vomiting, diarrhea, one soldier had a fever of 102. 3 of them from the 82nd. One was a staff sergeant who had apparently gone back for seconds. The aid station called the DFAC. The DFAC manager called me. I called First Sergeant Hensley. First Sergeant Hensley said a word I will not type and told me to shut the DFAC down and secure all the food from lunch service. I pulled everything, every pan, every tray, every container. I bagged and labeled it. I pulled the fryer oil for testing. I pulled the thermometers. I did this by the book because I knew what was coming, and I knew that if one step was missed, the investigation would find that step before it found the actual problem. Actual problem. Shen helped. Torres helped. Kevin stood by the serving line and watched with the expression of a man observing a moderately interesting documentary about someone else's life. By 1900, 7 p.m., I was in the company commander's office with First Sergeant Hensley, the DFAC manager, and a representative from Public Health who had been called in to investigate. The thermometers had been pulled. They tested all 3 against a known reference. All 3 were off by 8 degrees. The calibration log was blank for that morning. The fryer temperature logs showed a downward trend across the lunch service that nobody had flagged because the thermometer readings looked correct. The public health investigator asked me who had calibrated the thermometers that morning. I told him. He asked me if PFC Kevin had been trained on the Ice Point method. I said yes. He asked me if PFC Kevin had demonstrated competence in the Ice Point method. I opened my mouth and closed it again. The commander was watching me. First Sergeant was watching me. The DFAC manager was watching me. They were all waiting for me to say yes, so that this could be a simple training failure, a one-time lapse, something the system knows how to process. A soldier made a mistake. Additional training will be provided. Corrective action taken. Case closed. That's the story the Army knows how to tell. I could not say yes. I could not say that Kevin had demonstrated competence because I had never let Kevin calibrate a thermometer. Because I knew Kevin could not be trusted with tasks that affected food safety. Because I had been doing the calibration myself. His recruiting file. That's how the ASVAB investigation started. I'm going to shift gears here because the thermometer incident is what happened, but the recruiting file is what explained it. Or didn't explain it. Or explained it in a way that made everything worse. I put in the request through the S1 shop. Took about a week. What came back was Kevin's enlistment packet, which included his ASVAB score sheet, his recruiter's notes, and his physical and psychological screening from MEPS, the Military Entrance Processing Station. I also made phone calls. I called the recruiting station that processed Kevin. I talked to a sergeant first class who had not personally recruited Kevin, but who remembered Kevin's recruiter. A staff sergeant who had since had a permanent change of station to Fort Campbell. I got the staff sergeant on the phone. I told him who I was. I told him I had one of his recruits. I told him the name. There was a pause. A long one. The kind of pause where you can hear the person on the other end deciding how much they want to be involved in whatever you're about to tell them. Then he said, "The cook?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How's he doing?" I said, "He put 14 soldiers in the aid station." Another pause. Then he said, "Yeah, that tracks." "What do you mean that tracks?" "Look, Sergeant, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I knew Kevin was going to be a problem, but I'm not going to tell you I'm surprised either." I asked him what happened at MEPS. He got careful. Recruiters get careful when you start asking about MEPS because nobody wants to be the guy who put a bad soldier in the army. It reflects on their numbers, it reflects on their station, it reflects on them. So he was careful, but he talked. Because at this point, Kevin had already put people in the hospital, and careful only gets you so far. What came out of that conversation and the file review was this. Kevin tested at MEPS on a Tuesday. His raw ASVAB scores were unremarkable. GT of 191, enough for a 92G, but not by much. Kevin was set to enlist as a 92G with a GT of 91, and that should have been the end of it. But Kevin's MEPS test was flagged for a retest because of a timing irregularity. Something about how fast he completed one of the sections. I don't know the exact details because the recruiter was vague about it, which tells me the details were not flattering to anyone involved. Kevin retested. On the retest, his GT jumped to 114, a 23-point increase. 23 points is a significant jump. Not unheard of, but significant. It can happen if someone had test anxiety the first time. It can happen if someone studied. It can happen if someone was coached on what to expect between tests. The recruiter said Kevin studied. He said he gave Kevin some practice materials, and Kevin went home and came back a week later and crushed it. He said Kevin was real good at tests and just needed to see the format once. I believed that. I believe Kevin is real good at tests. I believe Kevin can look at a standardized format, absorb the pattern, and reproduce it. Kevin could probably score higher than 114 if he took it a third time.
The path to a college degree is more affordable than you think. With Sophia Learning, you can take real college-level courses that are designed to transfer, fully online for just $99 a month. Start your free trial, no credit card required. Sophia Learning, built for you.
It a third time. Kevin's brain, whatever else is going on with it, can recognize patterns in a controlled, written, multiple-choice environment and produce the correct answers. Kevin's brain cannot take those patterns and apply them to a kitchen, or a grease trap, or a fuel valve, or a thermometer. The information goes in, the test answers come out, the connection to physical reality does not exist. The psychological screening at MEPS was clean, nothing flagged. Kevin answered the questions correctly, which of course he did, because the questions were on paper, and Kevin is undefeated on paper. The screening saw a young man with a good score, no red flags, and a desire to cook. There was no reason to dig deeper. The system is designed to catch people who can't pass the test, not people who can only pass the test. I brought all of this to First Sergeant Hensley. I laid it out. The original test score, the retest, the jump, the recruiter's explanation, the clean screening. First Sergeant read it all. He sat with it for a while. Then he said, "So there's nothing wrong with him." I said, "First Sergeant, there is clearly something wrong with him." On paper. On paper, no. On paper, he's a model soldier who tests well and has an unfortunate pattern of practical errors. And we can't chapter someone for testing too well. No, First Sergeant. We're chaptering him for performance. Yes, First Sergeant. The pattern of failures, the food safety incident, the counseling statements, it's all documented. Legal is going to ask why a soldier with a 114 GT and a 100% on a food safety exam is being separated for inability to perform his duties. I know, First Sergeant. And your answer? My answer is the notebook, First Sergeant. My answer is 14 soldiers in the aid station. My answer is that the Army does not have a test for whatever Kevin is. And until it does, the only evidence that Kevin cannot do this job is the trail of things Kevin has done while doing this job. First Sergeant nodded. He said, "I'll make sure legal understands." He paused. "You know this is going to take another 2 months." I said, "I know, First Sergeant. He's still yours until then." "I know, First Sergeant." I went home that night and sat in my truck in the driveway for a while before I went inside. My wife texted me, asking if I was coming in. I said, "Give me a minute." I was trying to figure out what I could have done differently with Kevin, and I could not come up with an answer. I trained him. I documented everything. I paired him with my best soldiers. I followed every regulation and every procedure the Army has for developing underperforming soldiers. I made flashcards. I ran mock inspections. I gave him written tests that he aced and practical tasks that he failed in the same afternoon. Kevin beat all of it. Not because he was fighting me, because Kevin is something the system was not built to handle. Kevin is a test-taking machine attached to a body that operates independently of the machine. The machine is excellent. The body is a hazard. The recruiter wasn't wrong. Kevin is real good at tests. Kevin might be one of the best test takers I've ever met. If the Army evaluated soldiers purely on written examinations, Kevin would promote ahead of schedule. Kevin would be a sergeant before me. Kevin would be running a DFAC. That thought kept me up at night. It shouldn't have, but it did. The ASVAB didn't explain Kevin, it explained how Kevin got in. Getting Kevin out was going to take the rest of the winter. In the meantime, Kevin was still showing up every morning, still saying, "Roger, Sergeant," still doing his best, which was the most terrifying part because Kevin's best was unpredictable, and Kevin's worst was identical to Kevin's best. There was no gear shift. There was no telltale sign that today was going to be a Kevin day, because every day was a Kevin day. You just didn't always find out until the damage was done. I kept him on dish pit for the rest of December, washing dishes, the simplest job in the DFAC. Kevin washed dishes adequately. Not well, not badly, adequately. He broke 2 plates in 3 weeks, which is actually below the average for the dish pit, so there's that. Kevin was, for the first and possibly only time in his Army career, performing at standard. It only took removing him from every other task in the building. Part 5 is the last one. It should be easier to write than this one was. DFAC Kevin's last meal. Part 5. The chapter went through in February. It took longer than First Sergeant said it would because, of course it did. Legal kicked it back twice. The first time was a formatting issue on one of the counseling statements. The second time was because legal wanted a statement from the public health investigator confirming that the thermometer incident was attributable to Kevin and not to a systematic failure in DFAC oversight. That one stung because the implication was that maybe this was my fault. Maybe my leadership had failed. Maybe the system had worked fine and I had dropped the ball. The public health investigator provided his statement. It attributed the incident to Kevin. But the fact that the question was asked tells you everything about how the Army processes a soldier like Kevin. The system would rather believe that leadership failed than believe that a soldier with a 114 GT and a perfect test score is simply incapable of doing his job. A bad leader is a problem the Army knows how to fix. Kevin is not. The chapter was approved under Chapter 13, which is separation from unsatisfactory performance. Kevin would receive a general discharge under honorable conditions. Not a bad conduct discharge, not a dishonorable. A general, which meant Kevin would keep most of his benefits, which meant, as far as the paperwork was concerned, Kevin was not a catastrophic failure. Kevin was a soldier who hadn't worked out. It happens. People enlist, they can't hack it, they get separated, they go home. The paperwork doesn't capture the grease trap or the diesel or the 14 soldiers in the aid station or the 2 notebooks full of incidents that range from baffling to dangerous. The paperwork says it didn't work out. Thanks you for your service. Here's your DD-214. I had mixed feelings about the general discharge. Part of me thought Kevin deserved an honorable because Kevin had never once done anything wrong on purpose. Kevin had tried. Every day, Kevin had tried. The Army was separating him for something he couldn't control, which felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate without sounding like I was defending the man who nearly set the MKT on fire. The other part of me thought a general was generous given 14 soldiers in the aid station. I went back and forth on this for about a day, and then stopped thinking about it because it wasn't my call, and thinking about Kevin's feelings was a luxury I had not been able to afford for 5 months. Kevin took the news the way Kevin took everything. Calmly, He sat in the commander's office while the commander explained the separation process. He nodded at the right times. He said, "Yes, sir," and "I understand, sir." And then he signed the documents without reading them, which was consistent with every other document Kevin had ever signed in my presence. I stood in the back of the room and watched him and tried to read something on his face. Anger? Relief? Sadness? Confusion? Anything? Kevin's face was Kevin's face. Pleasant. Neutral. The face of a man who had been told it was going to rain later and had decided not to bring an umbrella. The separation process takes about 3 weeks. Out processing, CIF turn-in, medical screening, finance, legal brief. During those 3 weeks, the soldier is still assigned to the unit, still shows up, still works. The Army doesn't let you sit in your barracks room and wait. You do your job until the day you don't have a job anymore. So Kevin was still in my DFAC for 3 more weeks. I kept him on dish pit. He washed dishes. He showed up on time. He said good morning. He was, as always, polite. The rest of the team handled the news differently. Torres said, "Finally," and then immediately looked guilty about saying it. Daniels, who had nearly caught fire at the MKT, said nothing. Shen, who had spent more time with Kevin than anyone except me, was quiet for a while, and then said, "I feel bad for him, Sergeant." I said, "I know." Shen said, "He wasn't trying to be bad at this." I said, "I know that too." There is something about Kevin's politeness that made the whole thing harder than it should have been. A shitbag you can separate with a clean conscience. You tried, they didn't, goodbye. Kevin tried. Every single day. Kevin never once gave me attitude. Kevin never once refused a task or showed up late or left early or complained about being put on the dish pit when he was trained and qualified to cook. He just washed dishes and said Roger and went back to his barracks room at the end of the shift and did whatever Kevin did in the evenings. I pictured him sitting on his bunk flipping through the flashcards I had made him, studying for a test that no longer mattered for a job he was losing. And I had to stop picturing it because it didn't help. The LT came to see me during the second week. He stood in the DFAC office doorway, the way he always did when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. He said, "Sergeant, do you think we did the right thing?" I said, "Sir, I think we did the only thing the system gave us." He said, "That's not what I asked." I looked at him. He had been in the Army for about 8 months at this point. Kevin was one of his first soldiers. The LT had watched the whole thing from the beginning. He had suggested more training. He had believed in the process. The process had produced a food safety incident and a chapter packet. I said, "Sir, I think if Kevin stayed, someone would eventually get hurt worse than a bad night in the latrine. And I think that matters more than whether Kevin tried hard." The LT nodded. He didn't look satisfied. He looked like a man who had learned something about the job they hadn't covered at OCS, which is sometimes doing the right thing and doing the kind thing are not the same thing, and you don't get to pick both. During the second week of out processing, Kevin came to me with a question. This was unusual. Kevin did not ask questions often. Kevin operated on whatever internal logic Kevin operated on, and questions were not part of that system. He said, "Sergeant, can I cook one more time before I go?" I said no. He said, "Just breakfast, just eggs. I know how to do eggs." I said, "Kevin, I know you know how to do eggs. That was never the issue." He looked at me for a moment, longer than Kevin usually looked at anything. Kevin's default eye contact was brief and passing, the way you'd glance at a clock. This was different. He was looking at me like he was trying to find something in my face, or trying to decide whether to say something he hadn't said before. Then he said, "I know I messed up a lot, Sergeant." I didn't say anything. I have learned when to create a silence. This time, I wasn't using a technique, I just didn't have words. I don't know why I messed up. I know the stuff. I study it. I know. And then I get in there and it's like my hands do something different than what my head is saying. I can hear the right answer in my head while I'm doing the wrong thing. I just can't stop it. It's like watching yourself from across the room." He stopped. He was looking at the floor now. I thought if I studied harder, it would fix it. I studied really hard, Sergeant. I know he did. I saw him study. I saw the flashcards worn at the edges from being handled. I saw him in the break room with the TB-MED 530 manual open to sections I hadn't assigned. Kevin studied harder than soldiers who were twice as capable and half as motivated. It didn't matter. Studying gave Kevin knowledge. Knowledge was never Kevin's problem. That was the most Kevin ever said to me about Kevin. In 5 months, Kevin had never once described what it was like to be Kevin. He had never acknowledged the gap. He had never said, "I know this is wrong while I'm doing it." I had assumed Kevin didn't notice or care. I had assumed Kevin existed in a state of oblivious confidence, doing wrong things and believing they were right. That was easier. That made Kevin a deficiency, a line item, a problem to solve and move on from. Kevin standing in my DFAC telling me he could hear the right answer while doing the wrong thing was not a line item. That was a person describing something that sounded like a wiring problem he had no control over. And I am not a doctor, and I am not a psychologist, and I am a sergeant in the United States Army, whose job was to run a DFAC, not to diagnose whatever was happening inside Kevin's head. But I stood there, and I heard him. And for the first time in 5 months, I wasn't thinking about Kevin as a deficiency or a liability or a line in a notebook. I was thinking about a 19-year-old kid who knew something was wrong with him and couldn't name it and couldn't fix it, and had joined the army maybe hoping that structure and discipline and clear procedures would be the thing that finally made his hands do what his head was telling them. It wasn't. The army wasn't the fix. But I understood in that moment why he had joined, and why he had picked 92G, and why he studied so hard. Kevin wasn't trying to cook. Kevin was trying to be someone whose knowledge and doing were in the same room. The army was supposed to be the hallway. It wasn't. I did not let him cook eggs. It was the right call. I would make it again, but I heard him.
Watch baseball all season long. Catch the action live with YouTube TV. Terms apply. Cancel anytime.
Heard him. Kevin's last day was a Friday in late February, cold for Bragg. He turned in his gear at CIF that morning. He cleared finance. He got his DD-214. I know because I tracked his out-processing checklist the same way I tracked everything else about Kevin. Because even on his last day, I could not stop documenting him. He came by the DFAC one more time around 1400 in civilian clothes, jeans, and a hoodie. He looked younger in civilian clothes. He looked like what he was, which was a kid who had been in the army for less than 6 months and was going home. He returned a thermometer he had accidentally taken home in his cargo pocket, which I did not even know was missing. I checked it later. It was calibrated correctly. I don't know what to do with that. He shook my hand. He shook Shen's hand. Torres nodded at him from across the kitchen, and Kevin nodded back. And that was the extent of their goodbye, which was appropriate given the grease trap. Daniels was off shift. Kevin said, "Thank you, Sergeant. I learned a lot." I wanted to say something useful. Something an NCO is supposed to say to a departing soldier that wraps things up and sends them off with some piece of wisdom they can carry. I had nothing. Everything I could think of was either dishonest or cruel. "Good luck out there. You'll do great." That was a lie. I hope you learned your lesson. He hadn't learned anything because learning was never the problem. I said, "Take care of yourself, Kevin." He walked out of the DFAC. I watched him across the parking lot. He walked to a pickup truck where someone was waiting. A man in the driver's seat. Father, maybe. Uncle. Someone who had driven to Fort Bragg to bring Kevin home. Kevin got in the passenger side. He didn't look back at the building. The truck pulled out of the lot and turned left, toward the main gate. I went back inside. The DFAC was quiet. Torres was preparing for lunch. Shen was restocking the walk-in. The walk-in was organized correctly. The thermometers were calibrated. The sanitizer buckets were at the right concentration. Everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be. It had been that way before Kevin, and it was that way after Kevin. And the only evidence Kevin had ever been there was a stack of counseling statements in a filing cabinet and an inspection score that took us 6 months to recover from. That should be the end of the story. Kevin left, the DFAC went back to normal. I went back to running my shift without spending half my energy on one soldier. That should be enough. But there's one more thing. About 3 months after Kevin separated, I was at the PX, Saturday afternoon. I was buying motor oil and minding my own business. A staff sergeant from a maintenance company was in the same aisle. We knew each other, in the way that NCOs of the same installation know each other, which is to say, we'd been in the same meetings and nodded at each other. He asked me how things were going. I said fine. He said he'd heard about the food safety incident back in December. I said yeah. He said he was sorry about that. Then he said, "We had one of those." I said, "One of what?" Kevin. Not the same guy, different name, different MOS, military occupational specialty. But the same thing. Kid could pass any written test you gave him. Could not be trusted to change a tire without supervision. Told him left, he went right. Told him right, he went left. Showed him the TM, he could recite it. Handed him the wrench, he'd take apart the wrong component. We had him in the motor pool for 7 months. It was the longest 7 months of my career, and I've been to Iraq twice. I said, how'd it end? He said, Chapter 13, same as yours, I'm guessing. General discharge. Kid went home. He was a good kid. That was the worst part. He wasn't a dirtbag, he just couldn't do it. I said, did he know he was doing it wrong? He said, I asked him once. He said it was like watching a movie of himself. Said he couldn't stop. I stood in the motor oil aisle at the PX at Fort Bragg on a Saturday afternoon and felt something I had not expected to feel about Kevin, which was that Kevin was not unique. Kevin was not a once-in-a-career anomaly that I could file away as the strangest thing that ever happened to me and never think about again. Kevin was a type. Kevin was a category that the Army and the world at large don't have a name for quite yet. Somewhere on some post right now, there is a sergeant standing in front of a soldier who can pass every test and fail every task. And that sergeant is starting a notebook, and that sergeant thinks they're the only one, and that sergeant does not know yet how many pages it's going to take. The staff sergeant and I stood there for a minute. We didn't say much else. There wasn't much to say. We had both been through the same thing and could come out the other side, and neither of us had an answer for it. He bought his oil, I bought mine. We went our separate ways. I don't know where Kevin is now. I hope he's okay. I hope he found something where the gap between knowing and doing doesn't matter as much, or where someone figured out how to build the hallway between those two rooms in his head. I hope whatever is going on with Kevin has a name and a treatment, and someone who knows more about it than I do. I hope someone is listening to him instead of testing him. I lost the notebooks, both of them. They were put in a box that didn't make it between duty stations. Somewhere between Bragg and my next post, a moving company lost the box, or it ended up in someone else's storage unit, or it's sitting in a warehouse in Virginia. I don't know. I filed a claim. The Army reimbursed me for the value of 2 green hardcover notebooks at $3.99 each. $7.98. That is what the Army determined Kevin was worth in documented form. It bothers me more than it should, not because I need the notebooks, I remember what's in them. But here's what I think about. The Army is going to give some sergeant another Kevin. Somewhere on some post right now, it's probably already happening. And when that sergeant starts looking for answers, starts asking around, starts wondering if they're the only one who's ever dealt with this, I want them to find this post. It's not you. You didn't fail. You followed every regulation and every procedure, and it still went sideways because the system does not have a box for that yet. Here's what's coming. Here's what I tried. Here's what didn't work. Here's what almost worked. And here's what I wish I'd done differently. Which is nothing, because I've gone through it 100 times, and there is nothing I would change. Here's how many pages it takes to even begin to process the depths of DFAC Kevin. Honestly, I was very concerned that this would end with punching down on Kevin for what is very clearly some sort of processing disorder. But no. Thankfully. OP instead wants it to be known that people like Kevin exist. That people who can know the information and material front to back, but their body just doesn't want to cooperate, exist. OP just wants the box for Kevin to exist. Thank you all for tuning in to this extra long episode of Stories About Kevin, the DFAC Kevin saga. I'll be sure to catch you all tomorrow. Take care.